you kind of imply that the reason Warburg might have been protected because he was working on cancer, and Hitler was terrified of cancer. Having, I learned that his mother apparently succumbed to that. Do you think that was a major driving factor in keeping him alive or in the country?
Yeah, I do. It's really, the Hitler story is pretty incredible. He, as you mentioned, his mother died of breast cancer, and Hitler was sort of by her side in her last months, trying to care for her, and actually by the side of a Jewish doctor who Hitler actually really liked. And this doctor said that, he's never in his life seen somebody more depressed than Hitler, as he stood by his mother's side and watched her die as a young man. And, other historians have said he was, essentially a psychotic or sociopath. And, he couldn't feel for anybody except for his mother. Was the one person he was able to feel for. And, then he becomes a hypochondriac, but cancer is always sort of his obsession. Various points, he just stops everything that he's doing and starts talking about cancer, and even cancer and diet in some cases. And so Warburg comes along, and he has a lot of enemies even before the Nazis arrive, just because he's a difficult personality. And he really, he refuses to give the Nazi salute. He refuses to put up the Nazi flag. And, a lot of people want to get rid of him, at least chase him out of his institute. And they keep protecting him. And I think that the best evidence is that, had he not been focused on cancer, he would not have been able to retain his position. He was a member of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, which had hundreds of Jewish scientists before 1933. And he is the only one that makes it all the way till the end. And, there's this fascinating incident that happens on June 21st, 1941, where they actually bring him into Nazi headquarters. And you see that, according to Warburg's testimony, they told him directly that it was his cancer research that kept him there. And that very day, Himmler's notebook shows that he had a meeting about Warburg. And that night, Goebbels' diary shows that Hitler is talking about cancer research right after Warburg left the building. But what makes it really incredible is that, it turned out, I didn't even realize this when I started my research, that was only hours before the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, which is really kind of the central moment in the Nazi campaign. And just hours before that, they're dealing with Warburg and cancer. So it sort of blew my mind that all happened together. And it just shows you how obsessed the Nazis were. And it wasn't just Hitler. A lot of the top Nazis were very focused on cancer. And actually, the first experiments that took place in the concentration camps were cancer experiments.
Yeah, you'd mentioned, obviously to my amusement, that Hitler and some of the Nazis were quite fascinated with vegetarianism, veganism. They sort of wanted to push that on the I guess the Hitler Youth or something like that. That was something you alluded to. Did they continue to push for that? Was that something that was just passing, or was that a kind of common theme for those guys?
Yeah, no, Hitler, Himmler, and many of the others were really obsessed with vegetarian diets and all natural diets. And it sort of fits if you take a step back. And I was very interested in one particular book called The Nazi War on Cancer by the Stanford historian Robert Proctor. And he says that probably the best way to understand the Nazi mentality is as it's sort of a vast hygienic project, that everything has to be pure. And so, the food had to be as pure as possible in their minds, and all diseases had to be sort of eradicated so the Nazi Aryan body could be pure. And they wanted to get rid of Jews because they were one more impurity in this Nazi mentality. So they put food into this same framework, and they saw, sort of meat as, and this is sort of an ancient trope that, I'm sure you know more about than I do, how long these, biases against meat have gone on in the sense of impurity. But that was, I think, a rejection of meat in the context of being impure. And, Hitler sort of dreamed of this vegetarian utopia. They were going to invade the Soviet Union and have farms and natural food. So it's kind of frightening to see it all in that context. And a lot of the, in the post-war movement, the Nazis were left behind, but a lot of, the key thinkers in Germany had been former Nazis, and you see some of these ideological tendencies carrying over.
Yeah, one of the, and I'm like I said, I'm almost through the book, and you talk about how sort of Warburg's metabolic theories on cancer were being entertained. The biochemistry was still interesting until 1960s or so, and then you've got this genetic model, Watson Crick and the DNA being discovered in the like 50s and so on and so forth, and just not because there wasn't any science there, but because it just wasn't exciting anymore, I guess. Is that kind of what happened? People said, well, we got this new exciting technology, we're going to pursue that, and biochemistry is kind of boring. But then now there's been a resurgence. So can you talk about how it died, I guess?
Sure. Yeah, I think a number of different factors played into it. One was that, Warburg, as you mentioned, was a difficult personality. And since he was sort of, you know, so strongly associated with the metabolic views, when people disliked him, they also sort of disliked his science and couldn't separate the two. And in some cases, Warburg really damaged the theory himself by making extreme claims that he couldn't back up, that it was the only thing that mattered, and anything that didn't have to do with this metabolic shift that cancer cells do is completely irrelevant. So he harmed the cause himself to some extent, but I think the biggest issue, and also people were suspicious of him as being a Nazi collaborator because he had survived, and that lingered for many years. A lot of Jewish scientists, in particular, were suspicious of him. Robert Weinberg, who was very open about the fact that he had doubts about Warburg, and he became sort of one of the key players to establish the sort of genetic paradigm of cancer research. And to his credit, he was very open about that and actually endorsed my book and was very generous. But I think the biggest issue was just that science naturally goes on these sort of pendulum swings where something new and exciting comes along, and then everything before it is boring and uninteresting. So they'd start to refer to Warburg's research and the enzymes he worked on as, quote unquote, housekeeping enzymes. And everything that was new and exciting was, sort of tracing these genetic pathways through the cell. And, of course, if you just stop and think about it, that metabolism has to be connected to all this. But it was just sort of such a narrow view that nobody wanted to think about the metallic sides of things until the late 90s, when really what happens is these researchers are tracing these sort of pathways through the cell, one protein to another, understanding how a mutation causes, a chain of events. And it sort of naturally led them back to the metabolic reactions. And then, all of a sudden they found themselves studying Warburg's research. So it's kind of a synthesis. And what they really came to appreciate is the key mutations that had been associated with cancer, these, oncogenes, actually were very often the most important ones were metabolic enzymes that were allowing the cell to take up more glucose and to shift to this fermentation. So basically, their science led them right back to Warburg. And, and then there's this meta question of sort of the chicken and the egg, which comes first. And I think there's good evidence that the metabolic problems are at the origin of cancer, and that a lot of, what happens next is part of the evolution, but it is not the key sort of step at the beginning.